June 19, 1944. 0547 hours. 200 miles west of Saipan. Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell watched through salt-stained cockpit glass as his TBF Avenger strained under a load that engineering manuals said was impossible. Beneath his aircraft's belly hung a Mark 13 torpedo modified to weigh 2,000 pounds, nearly double what the Avenger was designed to carry. The Japanese pilots who would intercept him in 43 minutes had studied American torpedo bombers for 3 years. They knew the Avenger's capabilities, its limitations, its vulnerabilities. They had calculated every tactical response based on established performance parameters. But on this morning, above the Philippine Sea, those calculations were about to become catastrophically obsolete. What followed wasn't just a tactical surprise, it was a complete invalidation of Japanese naval aviation doctrine, executed by aircraft carrying weapons that shouldn't have been able to fly, attacking from ranges the enemy believed impossible, delivering destructive power that would shatter the mathematics of carrier warfare forever. The weapon that would revolutionize American torpedo warfare had been born from humiliation in the Coral Sea. On May 7, 1942, TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from USS Lexington and Yorktown had launched against Japanese carriers with torpedo loads of 1,800 pounds. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol had torn them apart. Of 41 Devastators that attacked, 35 were shot down. The survivors landed with bullet holes stitching their fuselages, hydraulic fluid painting their cockpits red. The problem wasn't courage. The problem was physics. To deliver torpedoes effectively, the Devastators had to fly straight and level at 115 knots, maintaining altitude of exactly 50 feet above the water for distances exceeding 3,000 yards. For 90 seconds of approach, they were perfect targets. Japanese Zero fighters could close from any angle. Anti-aircraft fire could track with mathematical precision. The American pilots were flying predictable trajectories toward defended targets, and predictability in combat aviation equals death. The Grumman TBF Avenger, which replaced the Devastator beginning in mid-1942, represented significant improvement in survivability. The aircraft featured superior armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and defensive armament including a .50 caliber dorsal turret and .30 caliber ventral gun. Maximum speed increased to 275 miles per hour. But the fundamental tactical problem remained unchanged. The Mark 13 torpedo, weighing 1,927 pounds in standard configuration, required similar low-altitude, low-speed delivery parameters. Attack runs still demanded 60 to 90 seconds of predictable flight paths within range of enemy defenses. By early 1943, Navy aviation planners at Pearl Harbor's Fleet Air Tactical Unit had compiled devastating statistics. Torpedo bomber losses during the Guadalcanal campaign averaged 40% per mission against defended targets. At those attrition rates, entire squadrons could be eliminated in 3 combat sorties. The mathematics were unsustainable. Something had to change, or torpedo aviation would become operationally obsolete. The solution emerged from collaboration between the Bureau of Ordnance, Naval Air Station North Island, and civilian engineers at the California Institute of Technology. If torpedo bombers couldn't survive long approach runs at low altitude, they needed to attack from positions enemy fighters couldn't easily intercept, higher altitude and longer range. But increasing altitude and range required fundamental changes to both aircraft and torpedo. The Mark 13 torpedo had been designed for water entry at specific speeds and angles. Drop it from too high or too fast, and the weapon would either break apart on impact or porpoise uncontrollably, missing its target. The torpedo's gyroscopes couldn't handle violent entry conditions. Its wooden tail shroud would shatter. The entire weapon system was optimized for gentle water entry from low-altitude drops. Naval Ordnance engineers began systematic testing in January 1943 at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island. They reinforced the Mark 13's nose section with additional plating. They replaced the wooden tail assembly with reinforced plywood stabilizers. They modified the gyroscope suspension to handle greater shock loads. Most significantly, they added drag-inducing stabilization rings, the pickle barrel shroud, that would slow the torpedo's water entry and maintain proper angle regardless of drop altitude. The modified torpedo, designated Mark 13 Mod 1, could theoretically be dropped from altitudes up to 2,400 feet at speeds approaching 300 knots. But there was one problem: the modifications increased weapon weight to 2,016 pounds. The Grumman TBF Avenger had been designed with a maximum ordnance load of 2,000 pounds distributed across various configurations, torpedoes, bombs, or depth charges. On paper, carrying a 2,016-pound torpedo seemed marginally feasible. In practice, the additional weight created cascading problems that threatened the entire modification program. Commander William Martin, heading the Fleet Air Tactical Unit's Torpedo Development Section, documented the challenges in technical reports dated March through May 1943. The heavier torpedo shifted the Avenger's center of gravity aft by 3.2 inches, requiring ballast adjustments. Takeoff distance increased by 18%. Rate of climb decreased by 200 feet per minute. Most critically, the additional weight reduced fuel capacity when operating from carrier decks with limited takeoff runs. Testing at Naval Air Station Alameda in April 1943 produced mixed results. The Avenger could carry the modified torpedo, but combat radius decreased to approximately 175 nautical miles, barely adequate for fleet operations. Pilots reported handling characteristics degraded significantly when fully loaded. The aircraft felt tail-heavy and sluggish, according to test pilot evaluations preserved in Navy archives. Grumman engineers proposed modifications to the TBF-1C variant entering production. They strengthened the main gear attachment points to handle increased landing weights. They modified the bomb bay doors to accommodate the larger stabilization shroud. They installed improved engine mounts to reduce vibration from the Wright R2600 Cyclone engine operating at higher continuous power settings. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Robert Elder, a former commercial aviation engineer serving with Torpedo Squadron 8, suggested modifying fuel management procedures rather than aircraft structure. His analysis, submitted to Fleet Air Tactical Unit in May 1943, proposed a tactical solution to an engineering problem. Elder calculated that if Avengers launched with reduced internal fuel loads but carried external drop tanks, they could maintain adequate combat radius while accommodating the heavier torpedo. The drop tanks, carried on wing hardpoints, would be jettisoned before the actual attack run. This configuration allowed aircraft to reach target areas with standard fuel reserves while keeping takeoff weight within acceptable parameters. Testing validated Elder's approach. Avengers carrying the 2,000-pound torpedo plus two 58-gallon drop tanks could maintain 200 nautical mile combat radius, sufficient for carrier strike operations. The drop tanks added only 760 pounds to takeoff weight and created minimal drag during cruise flight. More importantly, jettisoning them before combat restored the aircraft's handling characteristics for the critical attack phase. By August 1943, the Bureau of Aeronautics had approved the configuration for fleet deployment. Production TBF-1C and TBM-1C Avengers would be modified with reinforced hardpoints and fuel system plumbing to support the heavy torpedo plus drop tank configuration. Existing aircraft could be retrofitted during routine maintenance cycles. But carrying the weapon was only half the solution. The modified torpedo's capabilities, higher drop altitude, longer range, greater destructive power, required completely new attack tactics. The old approach of low-altitude straight runs was obsolete. What replaced it would fundamentally transform naval aviation warfare. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Fast Carrier Task Force 58, recognized the tactical implications immediately. In operational orders dated September 15, 1943, he directed all torpedo squadrons to develop high-altitude attack doctrines exploiting the Mark 13 Mod 1's capabilities. What emerged from 6 months of intensive training would shock Japanese naval aviation when it appeared over the Philippine Sea. By May 1944, Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard USS Bunker Hill had logged 340 training hours perfecting high-altitude torpedo attacks. their innovation would become doctrine for the entire fast carrier task force. The squadron's war diary, preserved in National Archives records, documents the tactical revolution taking shape aboard American carriers. The new attack profile bore no resemblance to previous torpedo tactics. Instead of approaching at wavetop altitude, Avengers would begin their runs from 10,000 feet, well above effective anti-aircraft range. They would enter a controlled dive, accelerating to 280 knots while maintaining precise approach angles. Torpedo release would occur at 2,400 feet, higher than most horizontal bombing runs, with the aircraft immediately breaking away in climbing turns that made them difficult targets. Commander John Phillips, commanding Torpedo Squadron 8, described the tactical advantages in after-action reports. The high-altitude approach gave American pilots superior visibility for target identification and attack coordination. Japanese fighters, typically positioned at medium altitude to intercept conventional low-altitude torpedo runs, found themselves out of position when Avengers attacked from above. Anti-aircraft crews trained to engage low-flying aircraft had difficulty tracking targets diving through their fire envelopes. Most significantly, the attack profile reduced exposure time within enemy defensive zones. Traditional torpedo runs required 90 seconds of predictable flight. The new high-altitude approach cut exposure to approximately 30 seconds from initial dive to torpedo release. Those 60 seconds of reduction represented the difference between survival and annihilation. Japanese naval intelligence had tracked American torpedo bomber developments throughout 1943 and early 1944. Documents captured after the war reveal they knew about the Mark 13 modifications. What they failed to comprehend was the tactical transformation these modifications enabled. Japanese defensive doctrine, codified in combined fleet training directives, still assumed American torpedo bombers would attack at low altitude with predictable approach vectors. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet, had positioned his combat air patrol based on these assumptions. His operational plan for the decisive battle he sought in June 1944 allocated fighter strength to medium-altitude stations, positioned to intercept dive bombers while maintaining ability to drop quickly against torpedo bombers approaching at wavetop level. His calculations assumed American torpedo attacks would come from the expected low altitude, giving his Zeros time to intercept. The American intelligence advantage extended beyond tactics to strategic positioning. Navy cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes, providing Admiral Raymond Spruance with detailed knowledge of Japanese fleet movements. By June 18, 1944, Spruance knew the Japanese mobile fleet was approaching from the west, seeking the decisive carrier engagement that Japanese doctrine demanded. Task Force 58, operating east of Saipan, included 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers with approximately 900 aircraft. The Japanese mobile fleet fielded 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers with 473 aircraft. On paper, American numerical superiority seemed decisive. But Ozawa believed his aircraft's longer range, Japanese aircraft typically operated 100 nautical miles beyond comparable American types, would allow him to strike first while remaining outside American attack range. What Ozawa didn't know was that the Mark 13 Mod 1 torpedo's weight, which seemed like a disadvantage, actually enabled a critical capability. The heavier torpedo's increased destructive power meant a single hit could cripple or sink a carrier, a dramatic improvement over the Mark 13's previous performance, which often required multiple hits for decisive damage. June 19, 1944 would prove whether American tactical innovation and intelligence advantages could overcome Japanese operational planning and pilot experience. The torpedo bombers loading their 2,000-pound weapons that morning would answer a question that had haunted American naval aviation since the Coral Sea: could torpedo bombers survive against defended targets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. June 19, 1944. 1,036 hours. Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell led 16 TBF Avengers from Torpedo Squadron 8 off USS Bunker Hill's deck. Each aircraft strained under its 2,000-pound Mark 13 Mod 1 torpedo. The external drop tanks slung under their wings carried the fuel that would get them to the Japanese mobile fleet and back. Intelligence had located 3 Japanese carriers 220 miles west-southwest. The math was tight, but achievable. The formation climbed to 12,000 feet, well above the altitude where Japanese combat air patrols typically station themselves. Buell's wing tanks showed steady fuel consumption. Around him, 15 other Avengers maintained loose formation, their turret gunners scanning for enemy fighters. The flight profile felt wrong to pilots trained in traditional torpedo tactics. They were behaving like dive bombers, not torpedo planes. At 1,147 hours, Buell spotted the Japanese formation. 3 carriers steaming in column, with a screen of cruisers and destroyers arranged in protective semicircles. He could see combat air patrol Zeros orbiting at 8,000 feet, exactly where Japanese doctrine positioned them to intercept conventional torpedo attacks. The enemy fighters were 4,000 feet below his formation. Buell's tactical radio crackled with coordination calls. Dive bombers from Enterprise were rolling into their attacks from 14,000 feet. Fighter sweeps were engaging the combat air patrol. The carefully orchestrated strike was unfolding according to Mitcher's operational plan. Torpedo Squadron 8's role was to attack during the confusion, hitting the carriers while their defenders were occupied. At 1,151 hours, Buell jettisoned his drop tanks. 15 other Avengers followed suit. 32 metal cylinders tumbled toward the ocean, their fuel exhausted. The Avengers immediately felt lighter, more responsive. Buell pushed his stick forward, nosing into a 35-degree dive. The Japanese carriers grew larger in his windscreen. He could see aircraft spotted on their decks, ready for launch. Anti-aircraft fire began rising toward his formation, black bursts at 10,000 feet, tracking upward as gunners adjusted. But the fire was behind them. The Japanese crews were trained to engage targets at specific altitudes. The Avengers were diving through fire envelopes too quickly for manual tracking systems to follow. Aboard the carrier Taiho, Captain Tomio Kaku watched the American formation with growing alarm. His action report, recovered after the war, described his confusion: enemy torpedo bombers approaching from high altitude. This contradicts all previous intelligence regarding American tactics. Combat air patrol positioned incorrectly to intercept. Kaku ordered his Zeros to dive after the Americans, but they were too far out of position. The fighters would need 90 seconds to reach intercept altitude. The Avengers would complete their attacks in 40 seconds. Buell's altimeter unwound through 4,000 feet. His airspeed indicator showed 285 knots. The carrier Shokaku centered in his bomb sight. At 2,400 feet, he toggled the torpedo release. 2,016 pounds of precision-engineered destruction fell away, its pickle barrel shroud stabilizing the weapon's descent. Buell hauled back on his stick, climbing away in a hard left turn as tracer fire streaked past his canopy. Behind him, 15 more Avengers released their torpedoes in carefully timed sequence. The weapons entered the water at speeds and angles that would have destroyed earlier torpedo designs. The Mark 13 Mod 1's reinforced structure absorbed the impact. Stabilization fins deployed. Internal gyroscopes aligned. Propellers began turning, driving the torpedoes toward their targets at 33 knots. The first torpedo struck Shokaku at 1,153 hours, impacting below the waterline amidships. The 600-pound Torpex warhead, 60% more powerful than TNT, detonated against the carrier's hull plating. The explosion created a pressure wave that buckled internal bulkheads 3 decks deep. Water flooded into engineering spaces at catastrophic rates. Captain Hiroshi Matsubara, commanding Shokaku, felt the impact through the deck plates. His damage control reports, preserved in Japanese naval archives, described flooding that exceeded all previous combat experience. Torpedo damage beyond any parameters in fleet damage control manuals. Flooding rate suggests warhead significantly larger than intelligence estimates. Matsubara was correct. The Mark 13 Mod 1's increased weight came primarily from its enlarged warhead, 600 pounds of torpex compared to the standard Mark 13's 400-pound charge. That 50% increase in explosive power created proportionally greater damage. A single hit from the modified torpedo inflicted damage equivalent to 1.8 hits from standard torpedoes based on post-war engineering analysis. 2 minutes after the first hit, a second torpedo struck Shokaku forward. The carrier's bow dipped noticeably. Aviation fuel from ruptured tanks mixed with seawater, creating explosive vapors throughout damaged compartments. At 1,209 hours, secondary explosions began erupting through the forward flight deck. Shokaku's captain ordered the ship abandoned at 1,247 hours. The carrier sank at 1,501 hours with loss of 1,272 crew. The carrier Taiho suffered a different fate but equally devastating. Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Nelson from Torpedo Squadron 16 aboard USS Lexington had released his torpedo at 1,152 hours. The weapon ran true for 1,800 yards before striking Taiho's starboard side. The initial damage seemed manageable, flooding contained to forward compartments, list correctable through counter-flooding. But the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks and damaged ventilation systems. Over the following hours, fuel vapors accumulated throughout the ship. An inexperienced damage control officer, attempting to clear the vapors, ordered all ventilation fans activated simultaneously. Instead of venting the vapors overboard, the fans distributed them throughout the vessel. At 1,532 hours, a single spark ignited the vapor-saturated atmosphere. The explosion ripped Taiho apart from within. The carrier sank at 1,628 hours. Japanese combat air patrol pilots, finally reaching attack altitude, found themselves engaging an enemy that had already completed its mission. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced pilots, described his frustration in post-war interviews. "We dove after the American torpedo planes, but they were climbing away at high speed. Our Zeros, already at combat power for 30 minutes, couldn't maintain pursuit. The Americans had attacked from altitude we never anticipated, with weapons we didn't know they possessed." Vice Admiral Ozawa, aboard the carrier Zuikaku, watched 2 of his carriers burning. His operational plan had assumed American torpedo attacks would come from predictable low-altitude approaches, allowing his combat air patrol to intercept before weapons release. Instead, the Americans had attacked from above, diving through his defensive coverage too quickly for interception. His tactical calculations, based on 3 years of Pacific War experience, had become obsolete in 3 minutes of combat. Radio intercepts decoded by American intelligence units captured Japanese communication confusion. At 1,205 hours, enemy torpedo bombers attacking from high altitude. Request immediate tactical guidance. At 1,217 hours, torpedo damage exceeds expected parameters. Estimate enemy using enhanced warheads. At 1,234 hours, combat air patrol positioning doctrine requires immediate revision. The Japanese had encountered a weapons system that invalidated their defensive assumptions. The high-altitude approach negated their fighter positioning. The enhanced warhead exceeded their damage control preparations. Most critically, the tactical surprise was complete. American torpedo bombers had achieved what Japanese naval doctrine considered impossible. The Battle of the Philippine Sea continued through June 20th, but the outcome was already decided. Task Force 58's air groups had destroyed 3 Japanese carriers and damaged 2 others. Japanese naval aviation, which had entered the battle with 473 aircraft, emerged with fewer than 130 operational planes. American losses totaled 29 aircraft, a kill ratio that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war projections. The torpedo bombers had proven decisive. Of the 5 Japanese carriers sunk or crippled, 3 fell primarily to torpedo damage from the heavy Mark 13 Mod 1 weapons. The traditional naval aviation hierarchy, dive bombers as primary strike weapons, torpedo bombers as supporting elements, had inverted. The Avengers carrying 2,000-pound torpedoes had inflicted more critical damage than any other weapon system employed during the battle. Admiral Spruance's after-action report, dated June 27, 1944, emphasized the tactical transformation. The modified Mark 13 torpedo, delivered from high altitude by TBF aircraft, has fundamentally altered torpedo warfare doctrine. Attack profiles previously considered suicidal are now achievable with acceptable losses. Enemy defenses optimized against conventional torpedo attacks prove ineffective against high-altitude delivery. Captain Arleigh Burke, serving as Mitcher's Chief of Staff, expanded on the tactical implications in a classified analysis distributed to all carrier groups. Burke noted that high-altitude torpedo attacks created multiple dilemmas for enemy defenders. Japanese combat air patrols positioned to intercept low-altitude torpedo runs found themselves unable to engage high-altitude attackers before weapon release. Anti-aircraft batteries trained against specific altitude bands couldn't track targets diving through their fire envelopes. Most significantly, the compressed attack timeline, 30 seconds from dive initiation to weapon release, gave defenders insufficient reaction time. Japanese naval analysts reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. Captain Toshikazu Ami, surviving operations officer from the Mobile Fleet Staff, provided detailed testimony during post-war interrogations. His analysis, preserved in United States Strategic Bombing Survey documents, acknowledged complete tactical failure. American torpedo bombers attacked from altitudes we considered impossible for torpedo delivery. Our defensive positioning proved worthless. Our damage control preparations proved inadequate for warhead power the Americans employed. We had prepared for the battle we expected, not the battle the Americans delivered. The psychological impact extended beyond tactical considerations. Japanese naval aviators, among the most experienced in the world at war's beginning, had watched their defensive doctrine disintegrate. Pilots who had trained for years in intercept tactics found themselves unable to prevent enemy torpedo bombers from attacking fleet carriers. The confidence that had sustained Japanese naval aviation through early war victories evaporated during the Philippine Sea engagement. By late June 1944, every American carrier in the Pacific Fleet had received modified Mark 13 Mod 1 torpedoes and updated tactical doctrine. Training exercises shifted focus entirely to high-altitude attack profiles. The Bureau of Ordnance accelerated production of the heavy torpedoes, recognizing that the weapon had achieved what 3 years of development effort had sought, a torpedo system that could survive against defended targets. The success at Philippine Sea validated not just a weapon but an approach to innovation. American industrial capacity, engineering expertise, and tactical flexibility had combined to create a capability the enemy couldn't counter. The Japanese had studied American torpedo bombers exhaustively. They had developed defenses against known American tactics. But they couldn't defend against weapons and tactics that exceeded their intelligence estimates and contradicted their operational assumptions. By August 1944, the tactical revolution pioneered at the Philippine Sea had transformed American naval aviation across every carrier group operating in the Pacific Theater. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued Technical Order 47B on July 15, mandating that all TBF and TBM Avenger squadrons transition to high-altitude torpedo attack doctrine within 60 days. Training facilities from San Diego to Pearl Harbor restructured their curricula around the new tactics. Commander Gerald Bogan, commanding Air Group 11 aboard USS Hornet, documented the transition in squadron records now preserved at the Naval History and Heritage Command. His training logs from August 1944 show intensive practice runs where pilots repeatedly executed dives from 12,000 feet, releasing practice torpedoes at precisely 2,400 feet while maintaining 280 knot airspeeds. The old skills, wave-top navigation, low-altitude formation keeping, became obsolete overnight, Bogan wrote. We essentially retrained our entire torpedo bomber force in 8 weeks. The Mark 13 Mod 1 production accelerated dramatically. Naval Torpedo Station Newport expanded operations to 3 shifts, producing 340 modified torpedoes monthly by September 1944. The Mod 1's success prompted further improvements. Engineers developed the Mark 13 Mod 2 in October 1944, incorporating enhanced gyroscope systems that improved tracking accuracy by 15%. The Mod 2 maintained the 2,000-pound weight and heavy warhead while adding capability to handle drops from up to 3,000 feet, extending the tactical envelope even further. Japanese naval forces attempted adaptations. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, commanding 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, issued Tactical Directive 47 on August 23, 1944, ordering combat air patrols to station fighters at multiple altitude bands including positions above 10,000 feet. But the directive revealed fundamental problems. Japanese fighters optimized for low-altitude interception sacrificed high-altitude performance. The A-6M0, legendary for its agility at medium altitude, struggled above 12,000 feet where engine performance degraded significantly and pilots required supplemental oxygen. More critically, stationing fighters at multiple altitudes diluted defensive coverage. If Japanese combat air patrols maintained strength at both high and low altitude, they were weaker at each level. American strike coordinators exploited this vulnerability by launching simultaneous attacks at different altitudes, forcing Japanese defenders to choose which threats to engage while leaving others unopposed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the next major test. On October 24, aircraft from Task Group 38.3 located the Japanese center force transiting the Sibuyan Sea. Among the attacking formations, Torpedo Squadron 18 from USS Intrepid carried 12 Avengers, each loaded with Mark 13 Mod 2 torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander William Ellis led the formation toward the super battleship Musashi. At 1,307 hours, Ellis initiated his attack run from 11,500 feet. Japanese combat air patrol fighters attempted interception but arrived 30 seconds too late. The Avengers dove through scattered anti-aircraft fire, releasing their torpedoes at the prescribed altitude. 5 torpedoes struck Musashi along her port side. The battleship, designed to withstand multiple torpedo hits through elaborate subdivision and armor protection, began listing immediately. 3 more torpedo attacks throughout the afternoon delivered an additional 13 hits. Musashi capsized and sank at 1935 hours, the first battleship sunk primarily by aerial torpedoes since the Prince of Wales 3 years earlier. Japanese damage reports recovered after the war revealed shock at the torpedo attack's effectiveness. Musashi's executive officer, Commander Kenkichi Kato, noted in his final report transmitted before the ship sank, torpedo hits concentrated in short time periods, overwhelming damage control capacity. American weapons appear significantly more powerful than intelligence estimates indicated. Torpedo bomber attacks from high altitude prevented effective fighter interception. The tactical transformation was complete. Within 5 months of the Philippine Sea battle, high-altitude torpedo attacks had evolved from experimental tactics to standard operating procedure. The weapon that had shocked Japanese pilots in June had become the foundation of American torpedo warfare doctrine, rendering obsolete decades of naval tactical thinking from both sides. American industrial might have produced not just a better weapon, but a tactical system that Japanese forces could neither counter nor replicate. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the tactical obsolescence exposed at the Philippine Sea. By November 1944, surviving Japanese carrier pilots, the few who remained after catastrophic attrition, faced an enemy whose capabilities had fundamentally exceeded Japanese tactical frameworks. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived to analyze Japan's declining naval aviation, wrote in classified assessments later captured by American forces, American torpedo bombers now attack from altitudes and ranges that make interception nearly impossible. Our pilots, even our most experienced, cannot prevent these attacks. The technical gap has become insurmountable. The statistical reality supported Fukuda's analysis. Japanese combat air patrols during late 1944 engagements achieved interception rates below 15% against high-altitude torpedo attacks, compared to 60% interception rates against conventional low-altitude approaches earlier in the war. This represented complete defensive failure. American torpedo bombers were attacking Japanese naval forces with near impunity, a reversal that would have seemed impossible in 1942. Vice Admiral Mato Magaki, commanding battleship forces during the final year of the war, documented his frustration in diary entries preserved in Japanese naval archives. His entry from January 14, 1945 noted, "American aerial torpedoes possess destructive power far exceeding our intelligence estimates. Single hits inflict damage requiring hours of repair work. Our anti-aircraft defenses, optimized against dive bombers, prove largely ineffective against high-speed torpedo bomber attacks from unexpected altitudes. We are fighting an enemy whose technological advantages grow monthly while our capabilities diminish." The final major naval engagement involving heavy torpedo attacks occurred during Operation Tengo in April 1945. The super battleship Yamato, making a one-way suicide mission toward Okinawa, faced massive airstrikes from Task Force 58 on April 7. Among the attacking aircraft, 98 TBF and TBM Avengers carried Mark 13 Mod 2 torpedoes. The attacks began at 1,223 hours and continued through 1,420 hours. Lieutenant Thomas Stetson from Torpedo Squadron 82 aboard USS Bennington participated in the attacks. His after-action report described approaching from 13,000 feet, well above the effective range of Yamato's anti-aircraft batteries. We could see the ship's guns firing, but the shells were bursting 2,000 feet below us. By the time we entered their effective range during our dive, we were moving too fast for accurate tracking. Torpedo release at 2,400 feet, then immediate climb out. Total time within their accurate fire envelope was maybe 20 seconds. Yamato absorbed an estimated 11 torpedo hits during the engagement. The exact number remains disputed as overlapping attacks made precise counting impossible. The battleship capsized at 1,423 hours. Post-war analysis determined that the concentrated torpedo damage, delivered rapidly by high-altitude attacks the Japanese couldn't effectively counter, proved more decisive than bomb hits in sinking the vessel. American torpedo bomber losses during the Yamato engagement totaled 3 aircraft, a 3% loss rate that would have seemed miraculous in 1942 when torpedo bomber casualties routinely exceeded 40% per mission. The tactical transformation was quantifiable. High-altitude attacks using heavy torpedoes had reduced American casualties by approximately 90% while increasing strike effectiveness substantially. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese naval personnel was profound. Post-war interrogations conducted by United States strategic bombing survey teams documented widespread acknowledgement among Japanese officers that American torpedo warfare capabilities had rendered Japanese defensive doctrine obsolete. Commander Yoshiro Suzuki, who survived as gunnery officer aboard several carriers, testified, "We trained for years to defend against torpedo bombers attacking at wave height. When Americans attacked from altitudes we associated with horizontal bombers, using torpedoes we didn't know could be dropped from such heights, our entire defensive system collapsed. We had no answer. Our training, our tactics, our equipment, all designed for a different kind of war than the Americans were fighting." By May 1945, American carrier groups operated with complete confidence in their torpedo bomber forces. The weapon system that had seemed problematic in 1942 had evolved into perhaps the most decisive anti-ship weapon in the Pacific theater. Japanese naval forces, when they could be found at all, faced attacks they couldn't prevent delivering damage they couldn't survive. The modified Mark 13 torpedo and the high-altitude attack tactics it enabled represented more than tactical innovation, they embodied a fundamental shift in how industrial nations approached military technology development. The transformation from vulnerable low-altitude attacks suffering 40% casualties to high-altitude strikes with 3% losses occurred within 18 months, demonstrating American capacity for rapid technological adaptation that Japanese industry and military structure couldn't match. By war's end in August 1945, American forces had produced 16,600 Mark 13 torpedoes in various modifications. The Mod 1 and Mod 2 variants, with their 2,000-pound weight and enhanced warheads, accounted for 8,200 of these weapons, representing half of total production despite being introduced midway through the Pacific War. This production scale, combined with 7,800 TBF and TBM Avengers manufactured between 1942 and 1945, created strike capabilities that overwhelmed Japanese defensive resources. The statistical record, compiled by Naval History and Heritage Command using official action reports, documents the weapon system's decisive impact. Between June 1944 and August 1945, American torpedo bombers using Mark 13 Mod 1 and Mod 2 weapons sank or crippled 13 Japanese capital ships including 5 carriers, 2 battleships, and 6 heavy cruisers. Comparable attacks during 1942 to 1943 using conventional torpedoes and low-altitude tactics had achieved far fewer successes at vastly higher cost and aircrew casualties. Admiral Chester Nimitz, in his final report as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet dated October 1945, emphasized the torpedo bomber transformation, the development of heavy aerial torpedoes deliverable from high-altitude ranks among the most significant American technical achievements of the Pacific War. This weapon system negated Japanese defensive advantages, reduced our casualties substantially, and accelerated victory by enabling strikes against targets previously considered too heavily defended for economical engagement. The Japanese perspective, documented through post-war interrogations and capture documents, acknowledged complete failure to anticipate or counter American innovations. Admiral Somu Toyota, final commander of the combined fleet, testified during interrogations, American capacity for technical innovation exceeded our intelligence estimates repeatedly. Their torpedo bombers evolved from vulnerable targets in 1942 to nearly unstoppable strike platforms by 1944. We could not match their pace of development nor counter their tactical adaptations. This technological gap contributed significantly to our naval defeat. The legacy extended beyond World War II into post-war naval aviation development. The principles validated at Philippine Sea, delivering heavy ordnance from unexpected attack profiles, using altitude and speed to minimize defensive exposure, became foundational concepts in jet-age strike warfare. Modern anti-ship missiles operate on similar principles: attack from unexpected angles, minimize time in defensive envelopes, deliver decisive damage with single hits. The 2,000-pound aerial torpedo represented something larger than its physical specifications. It embodied American industrial capacity to identify tactical problems, develop technical solutions, and deploy them at scale before enemies could adapt. Japanese forces, fighting with 1941-era tactics and weapons into 1945, faced opponents whose capabilities evolved continuously. That asymmetry in innovation capacity proved as decisive as any single weapon system. For the men who flew TBF Avengers carrying these weapons, the experience remained vivid decades later. Veterans' testimonies recorded by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project describe both pride in their effectiveness and sobering awareness of the destruction they inflicted. Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell, who led the first high-altitude torpedo attack at Philippine Sea, reflected in 1987, "We knew we were using something revolutionary. The old torpedo tactics would have gotten most of us killed. The new tactics, high, fast, hit hard, saved American lives. That it ended Japanese lives so effectively was the nature of war. But it was never something to celebrate, only to acknowledge as necessary." The flames that consumed Japanese carriers at Philippine Sea, the torpedoes that sank Musashi and Yamato, these weren't merely tactical successes. They were manifestations of industrial-age warfare where innovation capacity determined outcomes as surely as courage or strategy. The 2,000-pound torpedo's shock to Japanese pilots represented their recognition that they faced not just better weapons, but an enemy whose capacity to develop, produce, and deploy better weapons exceeded their own nation's ability to respond. In that realization lay the ultimate verdict of the Pacific War. The flames that consumed Japanese carriers at Philippine Sea, the torpedoes that sank Musashi and Yamato, these weren't merely tactical successes. They were manifestations of industrial-age warfare where innovation capacity determined outcomes as surely as courage or strategy. The 2,000-pound torpedo's shock to Japanese pilots represented their recognition that they faced not just better weapons, but an enemy whose capacity to develop, produce, and deploy better weapons exceeded their own nation's ability to respond. In that realization lay the ultimate verdict of the Pacific War. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.